All right, Coral, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Salome. Hello and welcome to the Pathways to Active Transportation, Strategies and Solutions Equity Roundtable discussion. My name is Coral Egnew. My pronouns are she and her, and I'll be your facilitator tonight. These equity roundtables were to host IBR staff with subject matter leaders about the intersection of equity and infrastructure projects. Monday was Bike to Work Day. Global Running Day is June 1st, and World Bicycle Day is June 3rd. And because of these dates, this roundtable discussion is centered on active transportation. Active transportation is human-powered mobility, such as rolling, biking, or walking, for example. I would now like to introduce our panelists for the evening. First off, I'd like to introduce Anna Zivarts, Director of Disability Mobility Initiative Program. Anna Zivarts is a low vision parent, non-driver, and author of When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency, Island Press 2024. Anna created #Week Without Driving Challenge and is passionate about bringing the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policy-making tables. Anna sits on the boards of the League of the American Bicyclists, the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, and Washington State Transportation. She also serves as a member of the Transportation Research Board, TRB Committee on Public Health and Transportation, and the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center Coordinating Committee. Thank you, Anna. Mara Krinke, the IBR Climate Officer. Mara is the IBR Program Principal Climate Officer and is a Senior Planner at Parametrics. She specializes in the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and regulatory compliance for transportation and other infrastructure projects, bringing over 20 years of experience in multidisciplinary analysis and collaboration. She majored in economics and botany in college and went on to earn a master's degree in public affairs. She lives in Portland with her family and is a devoted bike commuter, using that mode along with others to get to every job she's had since the age of 16. Welcome, Mara. Next, I'd like to introduce Natalie Owen, the IBR Active Transportation Design. Natalie is the IBR Active Transportation Design Lead and a Vice President at WSP. Natalie's career has spanned highway engineering to multimodal street and intersection design, with a particular focus on bicycle and pedestrian facilities. She is passionate about improving the lives in local communities through accessible, equitable engineering solutions for users of all ages and abilities. Welcome, Natalie. Next, I'd like to introduce Sarah Iannarone, Active Transportation and Climate Justice Advocate and Executive Director of the Street Trust. As mentioned, Sarah is the Executive Director of the Street Trust, a membership advocacy organization representing all street users regardless of mode. Street Trust works at the literal intersections of ongoing transportation crisis. Every day, our unsafe and incomplete public streets threaten our lives and livelihoods. She is driven by a passion for complete streets, rooted in the belief that we can stop preventable deaths resulting in inequality, lack safety, and climate change. She advised the 2023 Regional Transportation Plan and Oregon Transportation Plan updates, guiding our transportation future. Locally, she has founded the Arleta Library Cafe and the Arleta Triangle Project, investments to improve community safety and vitality. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and lived experience with us tonight. And with that, I would now like to introduce Greg Johnson, IBR Program Administrator. Greg is an active user of the current structure. He's walked and biked the bridge several times. Greg will share his knowledge on the importance of active transportation to the program, some of the work around funding related to active transportation, and multimodal aspect of this program. I will turn it to Greg, and he will give some welcoming remarks. Greg?
thank you everyone for attending our 8th Equity Roundtable. And once again, this roundtable is focused on active transportation, which is a key critical part of this entire undertaking. So I often tell folks that this program is misnamed. It's called the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program, but actually this is a multimodal effort to solve numerous problems in this corridor. And one of the key problems that we're seeking to solve is how can we make active transportation more vital, more easy to access, and make it simpler for folks to connect to destinations on either side of the river. So Coral mentioned that I've gone across the bridge a few times. Actually, it's now up to 42 times I've walked across the bridge back and forth. And it is a daunting challenge. I refuse to ride my bike across there. I've been a bike rider for coming on 50 some odd years, but it is an uncomfortable bike ride. And we are hoping to change all of that. And it is with discussions like this that we want to make sure that we are creating an equitable access situation for folks of all abilities who want to cross this bridge in the future. We want to make it an enjoyable ride or walk or roll for folks who want to leisurely go across the bridge. We want to make it easy for bicycle and walk commuters who want to go across the bridge in that manner. So having forums like this where we can discuss ideas and talk about designs and things of that nature is key to getting this right for the communities that this program will serve. So with that, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending our 8th Equity Roundtable.
Great. Thank you, Greg, for that welcome and introduction. And thank you to all of our panelists again for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and lived experiences with us tonight. For participants on Zoom, in the Zoom room, please use the Q&A feature to submit your question. At the bottom of the screen, there should be a Q&A icon, and you can click and a window will pop up for you to enter a question. If you joined via a mobile device or your Zoom window is smaller, you may need to click the More button to access the Q&A icon. For those who are watching live stream, you can email your questions to info@interstatebridge.org or simply send a direct message to the program, depending on what social media site you're watching from. We will now start with the first question of the night. This is a two-part question for all the panelists. And I want to invite Sarah to respond first to this two-part question. Can you describe your experience with integrating active transportation into urban planning? And have those strategies that encouraged walking, cycling, and other active transit modes evolved?
Well, and thanks for that lovely introduction, Coral. And it's great to have everyone gathered here together on this call to discuss this important topic. There really are a lot of opportunities for our community if we get this right, which is why the Street Trust is glad to be here tonight. You know, I think about it from a couple of different angles. At the grassroots, one of the ways I got my start in this was I called up the Department of Transportation. I said, hey, we got this beautiful park and community center and none of the kids can get to it because there's a busy street. So can we get a crosswalk? And the answer that we got from the Department of Transportation was, no, we can't paint a crosswalk there. It's not safe to cross. So I thought, well, heck, that's not a very good answer for my community. So we decided not to take no for an answer. And I went the route of organizing the community, and we ended up building a community plaza and gathering space as a traffic calming mechanism, that's what we called the Arleta Triangle Project. Almost 20 years later, in the middle of the pandemic, there was a serious uptick in gun violence there. We had seen, some pretty fast speeding motor vehicle operators who were engaged in behavior, as you know, which has really plagued our city with the gun violence. So we decided to expand that experiment even further and create even greater reclamation of that right away from those fast moving cars and reallocate that space toward human centric uses, right? Which is one of the things that Portland is really known for. In the interim there, I had spent over a decade at Portland State University while I was working on my doctoral studies, hosting thousands of city leaders from around the world who were coming to visit Portland because we were known as the world-class gold standard for transportation investments. They wanted to learn about the streetcar renaissance and the ways that we had brought that mode back. They wanted to experience our investments for people walking, biking, and rolling and using public transportation. So we've seen our innovations here land on the ground in a lot of places, whether that's bicycle infrastructure on Guam, integrated community placemaking in South Korea. We've seen the power of regional coalitions in bringing infrastructure and transportation investments through a mix of modes to Santa Catarina, Brazil, and many, many other places around the world. But what really gets people excited, I think, about Portland is the fact that we've been able to bring that creative placemaking and that human dignity to our transportation investments. And when we talk a lot about, you know, what's innovative and what's involved, the Street Trust was founded about 30 years ago, a little bit over 30 years ago now, as the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. And, you know, when you think about that early bicycling movement here, as powerful as it was powerful in part because the people who were driving it were powerful. They were largely able-bodied, a lot of men, a lot of white people, middle-class people with high levels of education. And what we found over the years is that that movement didn't include everyone. It didn't include people from a lot of different backgrounds, ages and abilities, genders, racial, religious identities. And that's when you plateau, is when you don't have an inclusive movement, when you don't have an inclusive project, when you don't have an inclusive community process. And so I think the real evolution here is how we take community engagement processes like EMAC, right, which is pricing for equitable mobility, or POEM, which the city of Portland did, which is also thinking about how we can get a system that's more equitable and take the input of a broader range of community members and incorporate that, not just into the program, but into the project design and even program evaluation. So a lot of what we've got going on here, we've been doing it at the top of our class for a while. I think the real innovation here is our commitment to equity, our commitment to inclusion, and the ways that we're really going to roll out these processes so that they work for as many folks as possible.
Thank you, Sarah. Natalie?
Thanks, Coral. So to take an opportunity to share a little bit about my journey. One of the first assignments I received straight out of college was to design a shared use path through a park. I loved the mix of both the technical side and the creative side, using both sides of my brain simultaneously. About a year later, I began working on the IBR program as an engineer in training. I was tasked with designing the active transportation facilities and working with the Pedestrian and Bicycle Advisory Committee, of which the Bike Transportation Alliance was part of at the time. I learned so much from that group about the community's priorities, their values, and really actively listened and applied what I learned to the next iteration of the design. I try to apply strategies to encourage active modes of travel on all projects, whether I'm working on a large program like IBR or a small last block connection. Because even the small design changes can really make a difference for members of the community who rely on active modes of transportation for daily activities. As to how the strategies have evolved, there's been a lot of research and experimentation in the design of active transportation facilities. I think a growing recognition of the importance of creating safe and inviting facilities for pedestrians and cyclists have really led to advancements in design. Some of these concepts that we use regularly in the industry, complete streets which consider all modes of travel equally, bike lanes protected by a physical barrier, shared streets, traffic calming, complete or protected intersections, which might feature a dedicated signal phase for bikes, for example. A lot is being learned from countries abroad who've been really successful in achieving Vision Zero. Vision Zero is a well-adopted strategy of eliminating traffic fatalities and severe injuries on streets. Safety for all road users is at the forefront of our design strategies, day in and day out.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Anna.
Yeah, hi everyone. Anna Zivarts here. So I am based in Seattle, but I have walked across the bridge before. I'm a low vision non-driver, as my bio explained, and so I can't drive because of a condition. That's also why I'm sitting so close to the camera, and you all get a good view of my forehead this evening. And I guess in my experience as someone who's never been able to drive, I have spent a lot of time biking and walking and taking transit places to get around. And I would say, what I think what we need to be thinking about here is what is going to make this a comfortable place for people to walk and roll, that people will choose to walk and roll. And part of that is, thinking beyond just, is it strictly accessible? But, is it a slope that's a comfortable slope? Is it a distance that's a doable distance? I mean, some of these things are going to be hard to resolve because of the length of this bridge, but can we think about transit connections? Are there ways for people who can't perhaps walk or roll or bike across the whole distance, but want to enjoy it to be able to connect to transit? And then in the context of, how do we make it comfortable, having spent so much time on infrastructure designed as sort of, attached to highway projects, I think, while it may exist and there may be these bike paths or multi-use paths, they can often be really miserable places to be because of the noise pollution and also the air pollution. And so I think that those are real big questions that we need to be thinking about in the design of any active transportation infrastructure. It's not just enough for it to be there and be physically separated. If you can't have a conversation with your kid, if you feel like you're choking on diesel fumes the whole time, it's not going to be a place you're going to choose to be unless you don't have a choice. And sure, there are those of us who have less choices, who don't have the option to get in a car and go. And we may be using that infrastructure no matter what. But what if we were to actually prioritize the comfort of people who are walking and rolling? And I don't know if any of you have been to upstate New York. Across the Hudson, there's a bridge called, I think they just call it the pedestrian bridge, but it's from Poughkeepsie. And it crosses over the Hudson there. And it's this huge tourism draw because it's just for people biking and walking and rolling. And I sort of think of that. And I know that there are lots of financial reasons that that's not going to be what we have here. But what a beautiful and different environment it is when you're not competing with car noise and car exhaust, and how much more relaxing and enjoyable mobility can be. So that's sort of what I dream of as our future.
Great. Thank you, Anna. I love the fact that, having people, providing it for people who choose to be here. That's a great way of putting it. Mara.
Thanks, Coral. And thanks to all of you who've given me so much to think about already. I would say that in my bio, I'm a dedicated bike commuter. And I think back to when I was a kid, the facilities I biked on in the middle of the night to go to the bagel shop or, down a busy road, they were pretty scary, but I did it because I didn't really have a car or a choice and I was going to a job, right? So I do think about now the evolution that I've seen just in my career is that those facilities are now prioritized and expected as part of what we plan and design. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction and gratitude that we aren't it's was kind of marginalized users, right? Or people doing it just because they had to, right? And now we endeavor to make a safe and accessible facility for all users, for both those who are using active transportation out of necessity and then those out of choice. So it is a dream to have this as a tourism draw even, or people using this for a recreational purpose. I would say also the evolution I've seen is, the early transportation projects I worked on were very highway focused and they didn't include active transportation, and transit. Other modes weren't really part of the menu of what we were considering. And as Greg said, this by its definition is a multimodal project, and that's just reflected in the priorities of our cities, our regional governments, our states, and the federal government is asking us to consider all modes. So that's just pretty great development over the last decades and driven by our public partners and our nonprofit organizations and just really making that voice more clear. So happy to be part of this industry.
Great. Thank you, Mara. I think that's, as Sarah mentioned, Portland was once the gold standard in walking, biking, and rolling, and now as we're moving forward, to complete streets and this being a multimodal project, I think we're really excited to have you all here and really help inform us about what's going on. Moving to question number 2. This is a 2-part question for Greg, Natalie, and Mara. How were existing trails and connections taken into consideration when creating the proposed active transportation plans for IBR? And what do they look like? Greg?
So I'd like to drop back and give a little bit of my background. Everybody looks at me, this is the big infrastructure guy. I actually started my career in the city of Battle Creek in Michigan. And one of the first projects I worked on was starting the linear park system in the city of Battle Creek. And throughout my career, even though I've built a lot of roadways, I've also built a lot of sidewalk, a lot of on-street bike lanes, and a lot of bike trails. And I've seen the transformative power of a neighborhood that did not have sidewalks before, and putting sidewalks where people don't have to walk on that beaten path and get mud on their shoes or walk in the street. So I think that what we do here is going to be incredibly important to connect and encourage folks to get out of that single occupancy vehicle trip. So as far as the connections for the area, we know that just on the Portland side, there's a 40-mile trail that's waiting to be connected. We know that on Hayden Island, there's a lot of foot traffic that currently walks part of the time on pathway, part of the time on mud and grass. So we see those things, and as a team, we recognize that and know that we can do better. On the Vancouver side, crossing I-5 is a challenge. So as we're looking at reconstructing bridges across I-5, making those connections that where if you come across, you can get to a destination without having to get off your bike or walk in the street or walk on a muddy path. Those things are key critical to encouraging higher ridership of bikes, of walking, of rolling for folks. Things as simple as making sure that these pathways are well signed. They have ADA accommodations with ramps and tactile interfaces. So all of those things are what this program is hoping to do well, besides creating a wide path across the river where folks can engage and have actually some stopping areas where they can view the beauty of the Columbia River and the surroundings. So those things are key critical to the program as far as making those connections in the community.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. There is another, two part to that question I forgot to mention as well, as that second end of it. But, and maybe I can jump in and point to Mara to answer that second part of that question, which is, how is IBR ensuring the accessibility of the bridge for all users?
I'm going to do part of the answer, I think. I'll turn to Natalie, who's the design lead, right? But I'd love to talk about the climate piece a little bit with that. I mean, we know that in the Pacific Northwest, summers used to be very moderate and pretty pleasant to use active transportation all summer long and often during the winter too. But what our team has been doing is looking at a wide range of forecasts and projections for future conditions and really thinking about what does that mean for our design. So we know, for example, that our summers, we're going to have many more heat days, so days above 90 degrees, and in succession. So in the past, you would have a day or two above 90, but it would cool down at night, right? So you'd have a lot of relief. And what we've seen in recent years already, and there will be more in the future, is there are more days in a row, and it's just harder for the city in particular to cool. So what does that mean? Well, maybe we can provide more shade. We can provide those rest areas. We have to think about the reflectivity of the surfaces, because what you put on the ground really matters for how much heat is absorbed. And we think about that for the transit stations, for people who are waiting for a bus or a light rail. And we think about it for active transportation. People are using their bodies for energy and moving through, and just how we can make that a more reasonable experience during those times. We'll also know that in the winter, we'll have more atmospheric rivers, so we get a lot of rain all at once, right? So how can we protect the active users who are out at that time in their transit? So I think that's kind of what, when we're talking about part of the climate framework, it is that resiliency. And for these topics where we have people out on, like physically on the infrastructure, we have to think about their experience. Always.
Great. Thank you, Mara. I think that's, very true. Using our bodies for energy and just, kind of thinking that, keeping that in mind and protecting, all these active users that would be using the system. I mean, it really does connect with what Greg was saying when you have those making the connections without much of an effort, and making that within the design. Natalie, did you want to add?
Sure, I can. I'll just add to what Greg was saying about the planning stages. The staff has been studying this active transportation facilities for a very long time. So at the very beginning, we looked at connecting to existing trails, as Greg mentioned, the 40-mile loop, as well as Renaissance Trail in Vancouver. We're making sure that those are wide and very accessible and great, comfortable facilities, some of which the program will be improving or replacing entirely. We have an understanding of planned projects, so we are connecting in and syncing up with any planned projects that will be coming up in the future. And as for the details, while we have an advanced design to describe specifically what they'll look like, the program will be applying the latest and best practices in pedestrian and bicycle design. We have a really robust set of design standards that we're using. That includes guidance from NACTO, MUTCD, FHWA, state and local guidelines. And to answer the second question about accessibility, we are designing to exceed Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. We are not designing to minimums. This includes wayfinding, physical design, and experience, as Mara mentioned, for people who have different physical and visual disabilities. For each design challenge, of which we know there are many on the IBR program, we engage in studies to understand all of the available options. One example, programs considering, multiple options for vertical circulation, such as elevators and ramps. The IBR program's conceptual design report will be released in the future, and that document will provide many more details.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Moving on to question number 3. This next question for today asks you for your insights on innovative strategies. This question is for Anna and Sarah. What innovative strategies should urban areas adopt to increase investment in active transportation, especially considering environmental sustainability and challenges of urban growth? Sarah?
Thank you for that question. There's a couple of things we can do. One of the things that Natalie mentioned early on was Vision Zero. I do think that taking a safe systems approach where we're thinking about a design that's built to fail, both when it comes to human behavior, the environmental challenges that Mara pointed out is one of the more important things we can do, which is this holistic whole systems approach. And we think about that through the lens of community and public health. We think about it through the lens of community connectivity. We think about it through the lens of how can we get people moving where they need to go effortlessly, as some of you mentioned, but also joyfully. I mentioned human dignity before. There's no reason that moving around our world should be such a hassle, so stressful and so complicated. So thinking about a system that's easy, that has redundancies built into it. I think it was Natalie who mentioned looking at not only the conditions on the ground right now, but the plans. I do think that's very important, making sure that we have a complete build out of this project as the beginning of the conversation with the community, not the end in terms of the investments that we're going to make. I'm thinking about things like the elevators that we're talking about. If we're truly going to have a station that's as many feet high at the apex of the bridge, as I've heard talked about, what does that mean if there are baseball stadiums down on either end of that, right? Not only are we building in things for different weather or different mobility accommodations, but even just capacity as we grow. So that's something that we need to think about as well. I also think that one of the most innovative things that we're going to have to do is figure out how we fund the things that we want to see. Historically, we were a leader when it came to coming up with the gas tax. And I know that got us a long way. And we even came up with things like the bike bill, where we would set aside a percentage of that money to make investments in bicycling infrastructure. We have the 1% for art, where we would take a percentage of public transit capital projects and build community art. So we've been thinking about how we reallocate revenue along the way. But what we haven't really come up with is a way to generate the revenue as we transition off the fossil fuel economy and transition off the gas tax, and then thinking about the reallocation of those dollars away from the status quo, where we've built an entire system around how we get people moving by a single occupancy car trip. And we really need to think about how we're moving people by emerging technologies like e-bikes, which need to peacefully coexist alongside classic bikes, alongside people rolling, whether that's on a skateboard or a mobility device or a baby stroller, right? As even they're moving from mode to mode, because there isn't a single mode for most of us that we use day to day. Even people who drive almost exclusively for their commute are still a pedestrian, likely at some point in their day. And many of us are going between modes, especially those of us who don't own a car or don't drive, because we may not depend on a single transit agency or even a single mode. We might move from bike share to light rail to walking back onto some other type of mode to finish our trip. So really thinking about that complete system, the complete experience for the user, and complete connected networks, not just for the present, but the future, and then thinking about new innovative ways to pay for them. It's no small task. I think we're up to the task, but it is a heavy lift in terms of thinking differently about how we get from point A to point B.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I love the investment in moving around joyfully, getting people to go to where they need to go. That's an excellent way of putting it. Anna, do you have something to add?
Sure. Yeah, no, and I wanted to build off what Greg was saying around sidewalks. And yeah, I've seen, some of the areas around Vancouver, that are missing sidewalks. And I think, our work, we started out in our organizing work doing interviews with non-drivers from throughout Washington state. And a lot of folks in, the greater Vancouver area participated in that. And in those, I think it's close to 300 interviews now that we've done. Nobody said they needed a bridge replacement. That wasn't, a priority for anyone. What people asked for were sidewalks, were safer crossings, were accessible pedestrian signals, was it better, transit connections across to Portland. That's a huge one. And so I just want to sort of, pull back and think about, what, especially folks who aren't driving, what their priorities are. And it's not really a small percentage of the population. Our legislature here did a study and found that 30% of our state the population of our state are non-drivers. And so that's a lot of people. And, you know, in a world where we could have everything, I would love to have a new bridge with, you know, wonderful, you know, pedestrian access and sun protection, elevators, and, you know, light rail. But in the resource constrained world that we're in, I have to wonder if, you know, this is the best use of our resources, considering we're missing so many fundamental pieces of transportation infrastructure for walking and rolling safely in our communities currently.
Great. Thank you, Anna. I think that's, you know, really important, like you mentioned, sidewalks, safer crossing, access to transit, all, you know, ways and to get people to come and use this new infrastructure being built. So thank you all. We're going to move to participants' questions. So thank you for every one of your insightful responses. And now we want to open the floor for our participants. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature or the email us, and we'll address as many as we can in the time remaining. Let's see if we have any questions.
Coral, Kellyanne is sending you a couple of questions right now that we got from various places, whether it be YouTube, our info inbox, and also through some of the registrations on Zoom. So she'll send that to you right now. But I do believe we had Greg raise his hand. I think he wanted to add to the conversation that just happened.
Oh, well, go ahead, Greg.
So as far as policy and strategies to ensure that projects include facilities for biking, walking, and rolling, one of the important things that the community on both sides of the river did was identify in the purpose and need the lack of connectivity for the biking, walking, and rolling. So getting that as a part of purpose and need was a key strategy that informs how we will make investments on this project. You cannot pick and choose. Once you have established a purpose and need, you can't pick and choose which purpose and need statements you're going to address. If you're going to use federal aid dollars, you must address all of them. And one of our key purpose and need statements is the lack of facilities for walking, biking, and rolling in the program area. So that's one strategy. I also think that making sure that you create partnerships. Natalie talked about the conversations that she's having with the biking groups on each side of the river. Those things are key important early on, and you can't just do it as an add-on, as a slap-on to the end of the project at the end. Integrating these designs early on so they are a integrated part of the project and not just a afterthought is key strategic ways to make sure these things happen. And lastly, I was in DC last week with the JPAC group, and we had a chance to talk to the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and they are mentioning that some of their programs are undersubscribed. And we described what we were doing, and they said, please make sure that you apply for grants. Now, we don't want to be the big 800-pound gorilla in the room and taking all the federal dollars, but we also need to make sure that we are not having dollars go to other areas or not get spent because the programs are not worthy of their investment.
Super good points there, Greg. Purpose and need, and definitely making sure that we are taking active transportation and the infrastructure to that in our strategies. One question came up in the pipeline, and that's for you, Greg. Why not a tunnel and then keep the existing bridge for active transportation?
This may be my favorite question, but I do see Sarah has her hand up. So Sarah, I don't want you to lose your point if you want to jump in on that last point, and then I'll tackle the tunnel.
Yeah, I know you have your tunnel. You can remember your tunnel response easier than I can remember my response to you. I did want to add something though, because I think what Greg's mentioning is really important, and we didn't touch on it in the earlier questions, but it's pretty critical. We're seeing it on the multi-use paths and trails that we're talking about, whether it's a $9 million project or a $9 billion project, and that's the perceptions of safety and public safety. It's increasingly a concern in these shared facilities across the community. And I know that you've heard it on the design team regarding the facilities for people walking, biking, and rolling, and we hear it on the community paths and other things. And so one of the innovations that I just wanted to flag for us to think about as a community is the crime prevention through environmental design, and how bringing the community in, again, through this placemaking and space activation approach, which may not seem like it's part of a transportation project per se, but whether it's a pickleball court under a bridge or a climbing wall, right, where there's, I remember the Zidell proposal down at the South Waterfront was thinking about putting a climbing wall under the Ross Island Bridge. I think we're going to have to get really creative on this project about engaging the community in ways we keep people safe while they're using these connected paths, walkways, and other active transportation on-ramps, if you will, to the project. Because we know that there are vulnerable system users who would be e-biking if they felt safe, or who would be biking, or who would be taking transit if they felt safer with their personal safety as well as the street safety. And it's not something that often comes up, but I thought I would flag it in this discussion in particular, just because of the scale of active transportation and the independence which people often move through space as active transportation users. And I know it's a place where we can actually improve upon some of the world-class bike ped rolling facilities that are going to go into this infrastructure project. So thanks for letting me insert that. Go ahead with your tunnel response there, Greg.
So this program and its previous incarnation, the Columbia River Crossing, studied the issue of Columbia River Crossing, studied a bored tunnel similar to what went under Seattle for the Alaska Way Viaduct. And on this program, we studied an immersed tube tunnel, which is where you actually do a cut of the earth and place segments of a tunnel. The other, you put a tunnel boring machine. So we looked at both types of tunnels that are used for transportation purposes. And there are several factors that led us to the conclusion that a tunnel will not work in this location. Number one, you have to be underneath the river at a depth. So you are underneath the Army Corps' dredging limits. And then as you are coming up, you have to hit interchanges. So the SR-14 interchange on the Washington side is one of the most used interchanges in this area. So we would not be able to get a immersed tube tunnel nor a bored tunnel up quickly enough to make a direct connection. So that means you would have to go north of SR-14 and use loop ramps to come back to it. And you know where that loop ramp would be? It would be right in the middle of Fort Vancouver. So these are things that our team has looked at. We have folks who love to build tunnels. They love to study tunnels, design tunnels. A tunnel will not work at this location. This is only one of the key things. We know that having a 50-foot deep trench cut into the bottom of the Columbia River and the banks of the Columbia River will be tremendously disruptive to archaeological and cultural resources in the area. We also know that you have to have very large air circulation units that would have to be maintained for years So a tunnel is not an inexpensive nor feasible way to cross this river. If it was, I guarantee you, we'd have embraced it, because we're not looking to make our job harder. But a tunnel just does not work here.
Great. Thank you, Greg. We have another question that's come in. Can you describe your experience with integrating active transportation into urban planning? How have strategies that encourage walking, cycling, and other active transit modes evolved? Who would like to take that one? Looking at Natalie.
Yeah, Carl, I thought this was one of the ones we had already answered.
This one came through in our chat, so
I'd like to jump in on this one if I could, because there are strategies, and Natalie mentioned the agencies such as NACTO, MMUTCD. There has been a migration and an evolution to more integration of active transportation into what was purely, folks said, hey, we're building roads for cars, and that's it. So this has changed in my career, where we are looking at how do you integrate? How do you do road diets and create on-street bike lanes? How do you now create sidewalks and side paths for people to safely walk and maneuver through an area? How do you mark and stripe so people feel comfortable and know where they are going to as they are riding their bikes? We went through an era where we were putting sharrows, the share road markings. So we are constantly evolving, I think, to a better place to integrate active transportation into overall transportation design. And once again, it has to start early. It cannot be an afterthought to once again try and retrofit something into a design. It's got to be an integrated part of what you're doing right from the beginning.
great. Thank you again, Greg.
Anna has her hand up.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Can I jump in? I just want to I think one thing that is super interesting about this corridor, and the time when I walked across it, all of a sudden I was, walking across, and there's the alarm, and then the bridge, the pedestrian area closes and the car area closes, and the bridge lifts up for freight traffic or for nautical barges or whatever. And I think it's so interesting because it really was such a powerful demonstration. I think in so much of our country that's so car dependent, we are used to the freeways always being, the priority, right? That car movement, that freight movement, that is what takes precedent in all of our planning conversations and all of our funding conversations. And that, we still have these rules on the books from before where nautical traffic was prioritized. It's sort of an interesting example of, it's just like we assume that like cars it is natural for cars always to have priority, but that isn't the case. And I think, so much of our active transportation design, unfortunately, still assumes that cars are the most important thing to move. And we can add pedestrian infrastructure, but it can't, especially along highways, impede that highway movement in any way. And I think that's the real question here with this project is, are we designing a system where the pedestrian and bike elements are add-ons, or are we actually trying to design a system that's going to reduce the number of vehicles, reduce our car dependency, reduce our climate emissions, improve our public health? And I don't think we're at that place yet, unfortunately.
So I hate to disagree with one of my panelists, because I've worked on projects all around the country, and this project is singularly unique. Number one, in that bike, walk, and roll is a part of the purpose and need. it is not an afterthought. We are integrating with designers who have great experience in integrating active transportation into a program. So we are not treating this as, well, we're going to slap this on at the end and try and make folks happy. We are having these conversations years before this project will break ground to make sure that these designs are integrated in and a part of. So we are doing, I think, some unique things that are different than you would see on a mega project anywhere else. Number one, you don't see a lot of bike, walk, roll facilities on interstate highways ever. And this one, we are integrating, we are making it an attractive part of what we are doing to try and get folks out of those single occupancy vehicle trips.
Great. Anna, Greg, thank you. Because I think that both of that insight leads us into the next participant question that that was asked, which is, what role does active transportation play in planning and designing transit facilities? Will one mode be prioritized over the other?
That's a good question.
I'll let Natalie jump on that one, so I'm not dominating the space.
Sure, no problem, Greg. Yeah, no, I was just having this conversation with some of our designers earlier this week, actually, and that no one mode is prioritized over any other mode. We are designing multimodal facilities that, for the first time in this corridor, I would say it do prioritize all different modes. We're looking at the transit facilities. In particular, we have an urban design team that is looking very closely at the active transportation access to and in and around those transit facilities. We're looking at bus stops and where those are located. Currently, we're looking at how to get people from, both sides of Hayden Island to the new transit station that will be there, and activating those spaces, looking at ways to connect them to all of the existing facilities. And something that, I've been encouraged by you, Greg, in the past to look at is, where are those little pieces, those little last segments that we can emphasize and remedy. So no, there's no prioritization. As a team, as a member of the design team, we meet regularly, and we all make our needs known. And so some design elements will push on other design elements. I have design standards for the active transportation facilities that are equally important to the design standards for the transit facilities, which are equally important to the design standards for the ramps. And so the ramps and the bus stops and the transit facilities and the active transportation shared use facilities, they all need to fit in a small space. And so we all need to give and take. And I think one thing that's really unique on this program, it may be unique, is that we really do take that very seriously, and that this isn't a highway program. This is a multimodal bridge, and there's a lot of space dedicated to transit. There's a lot of space dedicated for active transportation, and we're doing our best to ensure that it's one that everyone will want to use.
So currently, over I think it's like 89% of the existing width of the bridge is dedicated to car and the movement of cars. The new bridge, we will be down to slightly over 55% dedicated to cars. The rest will be bike, walk, will be transit. So this is a concerted effort to do things differently than was done in the past. And once again, not an afterthought, but a serious attempt to give people options of how they travel through this corridor.
I love the way you put that, Greg. Not an afterthought, you know, and it definitely connects with what Natalie said on the design teams. Every one of us are talking to each other. Every one of us has needs, and we all want to make sure that we all are putting in and making room and making space. And active transportation is definitely one of those pieces for that. So thank you both for that answer.
Can I add something, Coral?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I do think it's important there's a bit of, I think, middle ground between Anna and Greg's positions here, which I do think is important to forwarding the conversation meaningfully, especially when you're engaging the public and active transportation advocacy community. And this is a highway project, really. We are building highway capacity, but we're also building transit, and we're also building active transportation. And if I wasn't bullish on those public and active transportation aspects, I wouldn't be here. So I really do think that the team is putting out some world-class designs when it comes to the public and active transportation aspects. But I do think that for us to get this project right, we're going to have to be realistic about what we can spend on this project uniquely, and also how we're going to get a commitment from those partners outside this project scope for full build out of the network on both sides of this bridge. I mean, this team has done a very good job of bringing the locally preferred alternative partners along with a vision for IBR. But to Natalie's point, if we don't have a vision, if we don't have a plan to fund complete build out of these networks on both sides of the bridge, we're going to leave people stranded who could even benefit from the world-class investments for public and active transportation that are going to come along with this project. So I just wanted to flag that I think it's a little bit more nuanced than one type of project or the other. We do have a lot of things going on here: highway alongside transit, alongside walk, bike, ped, or walk, bike, roll. So just to think about that in the whole scheme of things, not just on this bridge, but on both sides of the river, and how we're going to get those communities to buy into and then invest in a complete network build out, I think is something that we really have to focus on now if we're going to get it done. Sorry, Anna, I didn't mean
Agreed.
time.
Yeah, can I jump back at what Sarah said? I think that is so true, that, how does the rest of that network get built? And, I think about in Washington State, when we go to the legislature and we're having these conversations with them about budgets and, the ask for the funding for this, part of it's from our state, right? Also federal funding, but that's competing against other needs, like other programs for sidewalks, other funding for any other transportation priority. And so just recognizing that those pots are small and projects are increasingly expensive, and the gas tax is less and less of a source of funding for us. So that those are all constraints. But I also, I recognize that your team is doing incredible work, and I'm sure the bridge design, having lived in New York City and biked and walked across the George Washington Bridge, which would close because the ramps were so steep when it was icy that they would literally not let you get across to New Jersey. Coming to Seattle, I was like, oh my gosh, I-90, there's a pedestrian path and the access is so nice and easy. And then I rode the 520, path, and that is, a newer generation, and it's better, but it's still loud, and you're still right next to a highway. And so, are we going to get to a place where it really is a place that feels comfortable and safe and enjoyable for active transportation users, where you're not getting exposed to all that traffic noise and air pollution, and that there's enough people using it where you're not sort of isolated there, alone in ways that can feel scary. So just, how do you get to that point where it really is a comfortable place to be?
Great. Thank you all. I think that was a really great discussion on that. It was really good. I do have a question for Greg. Have you considered keeping the existing bridge in place dedicated solely to active transportation?
It's a good question, and it does come up quite often. The existing bridge, as folks know, one of the bridges is 107 years old, and the other is 66 years old. So these are bridges, no matter what you are using them for, are past their expected life. And because once again, we don't know what would happen if the Cascadia earthquake does hit, whether this bridge would even be usable. But another reason is as we put in the new bridge, we're going to be putting in fewer piers in the water, but they will be offset from the piers that are existing. So you would be creating a maze for the river traffic that's trying to go through this area. So the maintenance cost existing on the existing bridge is $1.2 million a year for folks to staff that year-round, 24/7, 365 days a year. So that would be a continued cost. So this is not a cheap endeavor to keep that existing bridge, because right now one of the bridges has to be painted and a deck has to be replaced if we do nothing. And just that cost alone is going to be $250 million if this program doesn't go forward. So keeping the existing bridge is not a inexpensive, easy thing to do. But and then the connections that we're trying to make just become that much more complicated, because part of the southbound bridge is going to be in the footprint of the southbound bridge, the new southbound bridge. So there's a lot of complications to that question, but at this point, we don't see it as a feasible alternative, given the age and the cost of keeping these bridges in a reasonable condition.
Great. Talking about the costs moves us over to the next question, which is what funding mechanisms are in place to support the development and maintenance of active transportation infrastructure?
So I'll tackle that one. Our funding for active transportation is integrated into our overall cost. So we will be using dollars that we receive from each state. We'll be using mega dollar grants as well as bridge grant dollars to build out active transportation throughout this program. But the maintenance and the upkeep of these facilities are going to be key. And there has to be commitments to making sure that these facilities are kept up once they are built. Everybody loves to cut a ribbon on something new, and you don't cut ribbons on a resurfacing of a bike path. But it's just as important over the lifespan of that pathway that those dollars are identified and put in an asset management plan. And so the DOTs, this bridge and its related facilities will become part of the asset management plan that each state has for future investments to maintain and operate all parts of this, including roadways, including shared use paths and elevators. All of those things will be a part of an asset management plan of how to keep this facility in excellent shape in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, Greg. We have another question. This one's a good one. I like this one. Which, will the IBR program prioritize pedestrian access and overlooks?
I'll turn that over to Natalie to talk about.
Sorry, Coral, can you repeat the question? You cut out a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Will the IBR program prioritize pedestrian access and overlooks?
Oh, and overlooks. Sorry, there was the last part that I did not hear you. Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned before, this is a multimodal project. The program is considering all modes equally as we approach the design. It's part of our purpose and need. There's definitely a lot of work to be done on the design side. This program doesn't have the design worked out yet for the bridge. There's a number of different options that we are studying right now, which you will see once the EIS is published. And I do believe that, yes, there are many considerations. Overlooks is one of them. Good visibility and sight lines, minimal changes in elevation, steepness of grade, accessibility, wider negotiation room, signage, wayfinding, like all of these things are part of the design inputs that we will be considering as performance measures as the bridge design will evolve going forward.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. So this is a question I think each one of our panelists might be able to weigh in on. Why would we want people to walk and roll instead of take the bus or transit?
Could you repeat the last part of that, Coral?
It says, why would we want people to walk and roll instead of taking bus or transit?
I can give a good answer there. The Street Trust has just recently launched an e-bike ownership access program called Ride to Own, and we have 2 pilot areas, one right at the mouth of the interstate bridge project site and one further up in Park Rose in the Columbia Corridor, which is a jobs engine for the state. And many of those jobs start and end at times outside of TriMet's peak service windows. And so you've got folks who are trying to access work at times when transit's not easily accessible for them. And so something like access to a bicycle or an e-bike really expands opportunity for them. Some people we've found have to do a lot of trip chaining, right? So they have to make multiple stops in different directions, which may not be easy by bicycle or by transit exclusively. So they're thinking about multiple modes at a time, whether that's a last mile solution that's shared, or maybe that's putting their private, e-powered scooter onto a light rail train. You're seeing that increasingly. So what does it mean for someone to have access to multiple modes if they need to go in different directions than where the transit is aligned? And finally, not everyone feels comfortable on public transit right now. We've seen an uptick in hate crimes and gender-based violence and other situations on transit where if we don't create conditions where every single user is feeling safe in their identity or their personal, experience, then they might want to travel by a mode where they're not in shared spaces with other people too. So those are 3 reasons just off the top of my head that I can think of, and I'm sure there are many, many others. But our point is that we don't want to constrain anyone's opportunities. We want to give people the mode that they need at the time when they need it, that gets them there where they want to go in a way that they can afford, that is convenient for them. And so that's why we really lean into multimodal transportation systems at the Street Trust, because who is it for us to say how you get around? We just want your choice to be convenient, low carbon, safe, and accessible for you.
Anna?
I have a simple answer. Because biking and walking is fun.
Joyful, as Sarah likes to say.
Yeah, I have been a bike rider for, like I said, I'm 64. I've been a bike rider for damn near 60 years, and I enjoy it. And I think there's a lot of folks who like riding and who like walking. It's healthy for you. It's fun. It's a good thing that we can get more people biking or walking. It's the cleanest mode of transportation.
Yeah, and I agree with with all that, and it's, you know, it's a fun thing to do. And I do think it's really, there's purposeful reason for that too, is when we look at accessing transit, what does that last mile look like? You know, how are people going to make that connection, whether it's walking, biking, or rolling to get to these transit stations? And how do we make these transit stations accessible and engage our transit partners on how we can work together to help make these things a really great feature for people to want to take advantage. Anna, you have your hand up?
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna answer that last mile piece. I have an example of this, you know, in my own life. So I have a kiddo and a very heavy e-bike that I use with him, because getting him to walk more than, you know, 2 or 3 minutes is a real challenge. And so, but I can't bring the e-bike on the bus. It's too heavy, right? There's no way I can put it on a bus rack. I can, however, bring it on light rail here in the Seattle area. And so I will, you know, an example of why that sort of options are important, and perhaps being able to get across a bridge like this could be important, is, you know, I could ride across a bridge and then put the bike on light rail and go further, making those connections. But at the same time, I'm saying that I also really strongly believe that we absolutely need transit, and we need transit that works, because, you know, especially because e-bikes and larger e-bikes, accessible e-bikes, cargo e-bikes are so expensive, and not everyone has places to safely store them. There's lots of limitations there. Transit really is the backbone for so many folks of you know, how we get around, how we get groceries. So making sure that those transit connections and transit reliability and transit accessibility are really prioritized is equally as important, if not more important.
Great. Thank you all for your responses and all the great questions. I know I didn't get through them all, and it looks like we're coming up on time, because I have one last question for the group, and I want each one of you to be able to speak to this. And then for our final question of the night, I'd like to ask each one of you, what does it mean to be equitable in transportation planning? And are there ways to measure success? Starting with you, Anna.
Gosh. All right. You know, I feel, how do I answer that question? You know, I think about the work I do and how we prioritize our work as an organization as thinking about, you know, who has the least options, and how do we then make it easier for them to get where they need to go in their communities, and also for the resources and places they need to go to be closer to where they can afford to live. So those two sort of land use and transportation pieces together. So for us, it really is thinking about who has that access already and who has less access, and then really focusing on people with less choices currently.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Natalie.
Thanks, Carl. So engineers love standards and guidelines. So I'll answer from that perspective. Oregon and Washington both have really strong policies and approaches that establish expectations for integrating equity into projects like this one. In Oregon, there was a plan recently adopted, the Oregon Transportation Plan, which lays out really specifically some strategies, including the social equity goal. That goal is comprised of a couple of parts: improving access to safe and affordable transportation for all, specifically recognizing unmet mobility needs of people who have been systemically excluded or underserved. And secondly, creating an equitable and transparent engagement and communications decision-making structure. And that structure builds the public trust for the decisions that are made. So 4 strategies in these guidelines that apply to this phase of planning for IBR that I think can be used as a measure of success. So firstly, improving access to and convenience of a range of high quality, safe and affordable mobility options. Creating a robust transportation system that allows people to choose between reliable and accessible transportation options instead of relying on a single option or a substandard option. For example, the 4-foot paths on either side of the bridge today. thirdly, meeting or exceeding ADA standards, as I mentioned earlier, designing for universal access whenever feasible. And lastly, investing in infrastructure levels of service that make existing low-cost modes of travel, such as walking, biking, rolling transit, more convenient and available. Both the cities of Vancouver and Portland have similar policies for centering equity in transportation planning, and for defining the expectations and outcomes for projects. I think the job of this program is to live those values as we design. And ultimately, the measure of success for me is when it opens, seeing folks of all ages and abilities enjoying facilities.
That's fantastic. Yes, exciting when measured success when we open, you know, and giving people choices. Mara.
Thanks, Coral. I guess I'll talk about the program a little bit with the answer, and that's that the program does have an equity framework, and I think Salome is going to drop that into the chat here so everyone can see it, but it kind of has two focuses on process equity and then outcome equity. And the outcome equity is what I'm interested to see here, right? And it will work towards our climate goals, but moving people out of those single occupancy vehicles, because now they have wonderful choices for active transportation. And I think the outcome I hope that we will see is that people of all ages and abilities will be using those paths and those connections for our community, for their jobs, for their business, for their needs to meet family and friends, and then for recreation too. So I would just love to see kind of much expanded use on that bridge, which will serve a lot of important goals for us.
Great. Thank you, Mara. Theme here, choices, active transportation, providing those with choices. Sarah.
Thanks, Sol, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's been lively. I always appreciate people smiling about bikes, so it's good, and people championing public transportation. I do think that the IBR team has done a really nice job developing that equity framework, and I want to give the team some real props on the robustness of that. I do think that maybe there are a couple things we want to consider in addition to that. One of the things that we've been thinking about as we head into 2025 and a statewide transportation funding package, we have to figure out a mechanism that can get us transitioned off the gas tax and onto more equitable revenue sources. And so there's something to be said for paying fair share. And this doesn't get discussed as much when we're talking about equity, but really, you know, for decades and over a century, we've been investing money in making it easier to drive. And we haven't really talked about the disproportionate impact that's had on people who don't drive. And what would it mean to actually start to achieve equity in terms of investment for the various modes? 1% of the bike bill. I remember when I first took this job at the Street Trust back in 2021, I tried to get that share, that tiny 1% mandated by the bike bill increased to 5% on a project and was laughed out of the legislature. And time and again, to Anne's point, when it comes to the investments for people walking, biking, rolling, and trying to access public transit, I'll go out and fight for a $5 or $6 million project that's a rounding error in a mega project budget, right? And so there needs to be some parity with regard to investment. And I do think that fair share component is something that we need to focus on if we're going to get it right. That comes with things like funding projects for sidewalks for people statewide, to Anna's point as well, because for every penny that we're spending here in the greater Portland metro region, as important as that is to interstate commerce, there's a community in LeGrand or Ashland or Spokane that's not getting a sidewalk. And so how are we going to address that as well? Complete connectivity doesn't end at the edge of your neighborhood. It doesn't even end at the edge of our region. There are trails, there are other connections for folks if they're really going to lead complete full lives and get where they need to go without dying, quite literally. And I'm not saying that hyperbolically. We're watching a traffic fatalities epidemic like nothing we've seen in recent decades. And then I think the other piece that we might want to internalize, and these are the externalized costs, and again, Anna referenced them, but how are we measuring the air pollution, the noise pollution, all of these externalized costs that are dependents on the automobile are accruing primarily to our most vulnerable residents, our most vulnerable system users. We have not thought of ways to creatively recalibrate the system so that we're achieving the outcomes we need, so that people are as healthy and as safe as they can possibly be in their communities, while still having the access to opportunity and mobility that historically we've talked about car ownership as being the pathway to that, but we know increasingly that that's not the way. So are there other metrics that we want to start building into our equity matrices that are looking at, have we increased community mobility? How are we tracking access to jobs, education, and services? Is there a metric that says everybody should be able to walk safely or roll safely within 15, 20 minutes to their nearest supermarket for a loaf of bread? Is that the indicator of success? We haven't historically measured that. We've talked about it theoretically, but we haven't really put it into practice. So I do think to summarize that is a bit of who wins and who's losing under the current system. How are we measuring that and recalibrating it to make sure that the most vulnerable people in our communities are benefiting from some of the redistribution that this bridge project could potentially affect, especially through the jobs and other access to opportunities. So those are just a couple of things I'd add, but otherwise, good job on your equity framework, and keep up the good work on that front. Thanks again for having us in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I like that, connecting community within and beyond. I mean, really active transportation as we're looking at the project. How do we measure that? But Greg, same question. What does it mean to be equitable in transportation planning, and are there ways to measure success?
Yeah, so it's got to be purposeful. Once again, I've used the term, it can't be an afterthought. Looking at things through an equitable lens. When one of my favorite tools in transportation that I've used in my career are safety audits, to where we get a cross section of neighborhood, law enforcement, the disabled community, bikers, walkers, anyone who would use a corridor, and you get them and you do a safety audit of what is necessary to make a corridor the best possible it could be. What would encourage that use? And I think that's how you start getting to equity issues. You start identifying those gaps in the sidewalk. You start identifying, okay, maybe we need a different type of pedestrian signal at this location. So all of those things speak to equity, and it's got to be well thought out and not an afterthought. But how do you measure it? I think that measures of success come in the usage. We can build the best thing in the world, and if no one is using it, I don't think you can call it a success. But if we build something that folks want and they desire and they see their voice in it, they will use it. And I think that use becomes that measure of success. The process is tremendously important, but as Mara pointed out, the outcome. Are folks using it? Are they making it a part of their daily or weekly routine? That speaks of success.
I love the way that you put, can they see their voice in it as a final usage? That's an excellent way of just, we know we've engaged people, we know we've talked to people, and we've listened. And so seeing their voice in this project is a great way of putting it. Thank you, Greg. And thank you to all our panelists tonight for joining us. And for those of you who are watching, thank you for spending your time with us this evening. If we didn't get to your question, please email us at info@interstatebridge.org. We will get you an answer to your question. And this recording will be available on our website and on YouTube channel soon. If you'd like more information on future events, to schedule a briefing for your group or speak to a staff one-on-one during our office hours, please visit our website at www.interstatebridge.org. and stay in touch with the program through our newsletters and our social media. We'd like you to know that the 18th Annual Oregon Active Transportation Summit is June 5th through 7th at Left Bank Annex in Portland. And you can learn more about that at OregonTransportationSummit.org. IBR will be starting to table at events soon. And the first event we'll be at is a multicultural resource fair happening on June 1st in Vancouver, Washington. To find more events, make sure to go to our program calendar. We are at Interstage Replacement Program. Thank you so much for your time and have a wonderful evening.